Okay. All right, guys. So I have with me, I have with me Arvin, and Arvin, let me look up your last name, Villapando. Did I say that right?
Hey, that's pretty good. That's pretty
Fantastic.
good.
It's kind of good. Kind of good. All right.
Not bad.
I
I mean, there's like accents, but it's good, man.
I appreciate that. Tanner Kalstrom
Yeah,
with and is it Game Textures still?
yeah, GameTextures.com. Yep, that's what we're
Right.
called.
Okay, great. And how long
Yeah.
you guys been doing that?
Opened up our doors in 2012
Okay.
after a solid 12-month grind fest to build a
12.
website, learn how to program, learn how to do
Oh my God.
build a pipeline, and then build. I was showing Arvin this picture I took the other day
Oh, that's funny. Yeah,
of
I
a
remember that.
whiteboard that
Yeah.
it was just like a photo of a whiteboard at the end of 2012 that had my business model on it that I sent out and took a picture of it just to validate. And I think my initial goal was to make like 100 materials
Uh-huh.
and try to build a website with it. And we ended up launching with like 900 that we built over 12 months, just myself and one other artist,
Yeah.
all in the meantime of building a website and trying to figure out exactly what the hell we were doing.
Mm-hmm. And was
Yeah,
it
so
materials or photo reference, or what was the actual product at that point?
it was both. It was both. The whole thing started when it's kind of, I mean, it's actually kind of a funny story with that. Is I had just been through like a horrible breakup, and I met
Nice.
this girl. I met this girl at a bar, and she was like, "What do you do?" And I was like, "I own a texture company." And like at this point, it was just a thought in my head. Maybe I'll start this someday, and maybe that'll work. And turns out I really liked her, and she really liked me, and I really didn't want to look like a liar.
That's awesome.
So I really didn't want to look like a liar to her. So I made a commitment one night at some random, I don't know, drinking thing in Seattle, and woke up the next day and just started grinding on it. Yeah, and I didn't look like a liar to her. Is the good news. We ended up getting married, so it all ended up working out okay as a solid love story based around a little white lie that I may have told.
Yeah, and a whole lot of drinks.
It was a couple drinks. It was a
Couple.
couple beers. Yeah.
Oh man, that is so
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, that was a good story.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love to hear. So, if I remember right, because I remember seeing the site when it came up, like it was a ton of textures, or am I remembering something wrong?
No, that's right. It was we started out as textures. I was just really frustrated. I had been using whatever Google Images to find
Yeah,
textures and turn them into, I mean, you remember how it was
totally.
back then. Like, to build a texture, it was like a 3 or 4 hour commitment sometimes, and it was just really frustrating and
Hmm.
annoying. And I thought that there had to be a much better way. And
Yeah, so it was actually, I mean, even from the start, because I remembered actually I jumped on and tried them out when they were doing the Tornado Twins.
Hmm.
They had the Tornado Twins giveaway. They were like, build a game in 3 months or whatever. And
yeah,
I remembered I grabbed some and I was like, wow, these are really cool because they had the normal maps, they had the, gloss and spec. And I was like, wow, this is kind of nice to be able to just essentially grab a stack of texture, essentially a fully built material and just slap it onto a surface. So
Hmm.
it was really funny though. I mean, the whole thing seemed crazy to me. I mean, especially because back then there was not tools for what we were doing. We were using essentially Crazy Bump and the NVIDIA filter, the NVIDIA normal map filter,
Hmm.
and trying to learn as we went. There was no tools for creating a normal map. There was no real great way to visualize what a material even looked like in 3D,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So we would essentially build these out and test them in Unreal Development Kit in UDK, and hope they worked, right? And there was this huge iteration process and tons of textures and tons of saving and checking and projects, and it was really a lot of work to build a material back then in a way
Hmm.
that was in a way where you could guarantee that it was realistic and that it had the correct texture maps, right?
Yeah.
And then this is even before people were using like height maps and gloss maps. So we were doing that stuff as well. And that was really one of the big differences that most people were just making like specularity and a base color or a diffuse map and a normal map, if they even bothered with a normal map at that point. So
Right. Instead of just putting the diffuse in there.
yeah, and a lot of times it was just the diffuse, right? Especially in those old UDK games, like most of them were probably just diffuse only. So we were really trying to battle into this niche that I hoped might become a reality. And a lot of it is just us getting lucky in a lot of ways. We put in the work and the timing was there.
Yeah.
So it started out as us hating building textures, which ended up becoming our full-time job, was building textures.
I love that, because that happens in business all the time.
Yeah.
You don't realize, you're like, hey, I'm gonna do this thing so I don't have to work anymore. You start a business, next thing you know, you're working the whole time, right?
Yeah, right. And and again, like I said, I mentioned before that it was a product of timing. So I mentioned also that I had started this because of a horrible breakup in my life, and which is fine. Like I have no ill whatever, but I moved to Seattle essentially, and right as I moved to Seattle, the next day Microsoft announced that they were laying off like 3,200 game developers in Seattle. So I quit my job at Lego, where I was doing like video game work on all the Lego games. Quit my job at Lego, moved to Seattle. I was like, man, the industry is going to be awesome in Seattle when I get there. And not kidding. Next day, Microsoft lays off almost their entire game development system, ecosystem, really. And, obviously there was no jobs all of a sudden, because there was people with far more experience and far more talent and far more, connections.
Yeah.
Building games and applying for all of these jobs. So, it's
So you started your own thing, then, huh?
It's a product of just being stubborn, I suppose, and not really wanting to be unemployed. I did a brief stint at Starbucks here in Seattle.
Yeah.
In the meantime, I ran out of money, so I was working these like 4 a.m. morning shifts, because the new guy at Starbucks works the 4 a.m. morning shifts, and people were yelling at me, and people were getting so upset over their coffee, and I was the worst barista of all time, like by a wide margin. I'm just like, I'm not daydreaming. I'm not even present. I get woke from my daydream by some person at 4 a.m. yelling at me that I messed up their drink, and I was just kind of miserable. So, all of those things combined, and you start a company and get lucky, and things go your way.
I think it's sucking at things is underrated. Like there's just some things you should really suck at. Otherwise, you just can end up doing them.
Oh man, I mean, we suck at everything really. Like the product of game textures is a matter of sheer willpower. Because the reality is, and Arvin can attest to this, is that we're learning every single day as we go.
Yeah, fail fast, right?
That's fast, kind of
been, that's been our, and then you learn, right? You fail, you learn, and then you try something else, and then you've got, eventually something comes up, right? So,
yeah. Don't be scared, Jan. Don't be scared. It's really rewarding, and it's easier than ever, thanks to a number of things. Technology being part of it, and the other part of it being that I'm not sure if you're in the U.S., Jan.
He's in Europe.
In Europe. Well, the economy is really positioned towards small business right now. Even in Europe, there's so many systems that work in your advantage. Yeah, Germany, right? There's so many systems that work to your advantage for business ownership. And there's so many tools, you don't have to handle 90% of the tedium that was there in 2010, 2011 in a lot of ways. Like there's
your
payroll,
back end.
Of,
oh God, yeah. Let's talk about payroll and all that stuff later. But your back end has got to be way different for the site. Or are you still what do you guys use for an infrastructure? Do you custom code or?
That's a funny thing. I was just about to get into that. Yeah. So right now I came in as a texture artist.
Yeah.
And from a texture artist, I've shifted to
/ customer support. Yeah.
It was like I came in as a texture artist / customer support, And from there, I shifted to some business dev stuff. And eventually now my main thing is I develop our pipeline, right? I'm in charge of our pipeline thing. And, going back to the idea of things being easier now than ever, that's kind of one of the nice things is I came in, my only background in coding was I took 2 C++ classes in high school. When I got in, I was like, well, we needed some tools to automate some of our systems and essentially manage the files.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I took 2 C++ classes in high school. I can see what I can come up with. And so I took about, I don't know, just a month putting some random stuff together, and it worked. It worked. And we were like, let's make this so that we never have to write this thing again. It'll last forever. And lo and behold, now I'm building a new thing for us. And that was like maybe 2 years ago. But the cool thing is now the tools make so accessible. There's so much accessibility to it. So as far as what we use to manage, so the website has its own system, but we have our own system for managing stuff locally.
Okay.
So essentially, I could probably share the screenshot of what that looks like now.
Show it off.
Let me pop it up. And you guys are seeing basically the ArtStation page right now, right?
Yeah.
Is that that's being screen shared?
That's what we're seeing.
Okay. So we're still in the middle of it. We've got a kind of new website that we're working on right now for our stuff. But essentially, this is our management system where we can browse all of our textures locally, right? We can, switch over. We've got some hacked systems right now because we're trying to translate all of our old, the stuff all the way from back in 2012, and we're trying to make it relevant. So we've created some different systems where they mix and match with substances. So there's essentially like a bitmap with layered substances on it that we're kind of building. So basically right now we have, these are the oldest sets and these are the second sets. As you go along, you change your processes, and unless you have a system to really manage it, there's kind of a million different ways that everybody does it. You could pick a material, and essentially right now we can run, various commands through it. So this would be like turning it into an SBSAR and rendering out 4K images. We have an upres command, so everything we built was formerly in 2K. We have something that'll bump it up to 4K. You can batch a whole set.
Damn. Those classes went a long way for you. Holy crap.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually we went to see Black Panther, and I saw my teacher at that class.
Yeah,
I was like, "You'll never believe it! I'm actually doing something with your class."
Just through the power of Google and literally beating your head against a wall, you figured out how to program and build a pipeline for an entire team. Which not to brag, but we went from building 1 or 2 products a day to potentially building like 8 or 9 products a day by having proper tools and a proper
workflow.
A proper like modular workflow, right? That was one of the huge pitches that we always made, was that in theory every material we build should increase our speed on the next one at some level, right? So we should always be building on ourselves. If we build a plain wood material, we should be able to take that and turn it into a wood floor very easily.
Totally.
And that was the case, but because we were using Photoshop in that time, it was not always like the ideal workflow. It was like, kind of a pain in the butt, really. You had to, it just wasn't easy. So we can kind of transition to it.
Yeah.
Jan said.
And frankly, we didn't have the tools, right?
Yeah,
so we could sit there and we could build it. But now, right, we have, because we have, going back to the tool, we have a tool that can do it for us. We could literally, like for these, it sets up a template and then it feeds all of the bitmaps through the template. And now we've got a completely new, kind of procedural like material.
So tell me what this is like right now, because materials and texturing is still an area that, it's like once you know it, but people who don't know it, it's still like, that's unicorn land. It can be crazy. So why don't you explain a little bit about what this is? We were earlier talking about Photoshop and just dealing with Photoshop textures, but you guys are doing something totally different, and I'm sure PBR kind of changed, the whole landscape for you.
PBR changed the world.
Yeah.
It really did. I was like, man, I never have to manually paint a highlight again. It's just there.
Yeah. Changed the world, and it also is very important because it gave us standards to work from. Before PBR, there was no standards. There was nothing. It was just, this looks good, ship it. So yeah, PBR changed everything, and we were the first texture library, material library by 3 years to have any sort of PBR, and we did that all by hand. We opened up all of our old Photoshop files, processed, converted every single texture that we ever made into a physically based version of itself.
Converting albedos, all that stuff.
Yep. That's that elbow grease we were talking about, where you just put your head down and open up Photoshop files and go.
As far as describing kind of what a texture / material is, right? And if you want to, I could kind of
please.
I mean, I know you know what it is, but so basically, it's the way I describe it. I've taught before, and I'm actually doing some classes now. But the way I try to tell people what a material is it's essentially the way light reacts to a surface, right? So you've got, let me move your heads here, right? So you've got the mesh, which defines the shape, and then you've got the material, which defines what happens when light hits it, right? And in order to define what happens when light hits it, you give it basically a set of bits of information. And the way we communicate that information to the computer is through images, right? Through 2D images. So let me kind of just give a short kind of example of that. So I'm just going to build what we have. Basically, this means that it's physically based, so it's PBR, right? And we're using a metallic roughness model, right? So we've got, two primary models. There's the metallic roughness and spec gloss, right? Most systems, I think, are using this now. All right. So basically, it's asking for essentially 5 bits of information here, right? The base color, the normal, the roughness, the metallic, and the height. Essentially 5 images, right? 5 images or colors or some sort of square that defines how light reacts at these particular channels.
And,
so
and
the base
I guess
color
we should take a moment to hear and say, like, the previous models for this were built on basically diffuse and specular, right?
Yeah, and it was very touch and go.
Right, and so those were approximations, and they were written probably 15, 20, I can't remember now. They were written a long ass time ago. All those calculations are written a long time ago.
Yeah.
And so now the primary thing is, and this will all change later, because all we're doing is we're working with models that help us get closer to, in theoretical or mathematical models, really, that help us get closer to representation. So normal, roughness, all of that could change, but right now this is, probably the best that we have.
Right.
It could change, and we think it will change, but I think it'll continue to divide within this system. It's going to continue to change within this paradigm where we're defining these key aspects of what a material is. And I think that what's going to happen is, and we've already seen some of this, is that they're going to kind of start to split away these more simplified materials like specularity and metalness, for instance, and split that into a few different textures to get more accurate results. So I think that this is a system that's going to be here for a little while, but I do expect for it to continue to sort of subdivide within itself as it goes, and which is great for us.
And the real nice thing about PBR is that the maps that we're defining are finally now based on physics, right? So it's based on what's actually how light works on a surface, as opposed to, as you mentioned, the old method of, specular is essentially, we're like, hey, paint here to make it shiny, add.
Yeah.
Oh
I mean, that was it, right? Like add more specular and add more white here to make the surface shinier and shinier. And it's not even a reflection. You're just like making it shiny. With this system, it's actually, hey, this is, we want to define what, how rough the surface is, whether the light gets, reflected when it hits it, or the light gets diffused, or, etc. So here, we can, just to kind of give quick examples, we define the color, right? And it's going to react in this cube right here. So we're just going to add the roughness. The roughness is basically the quote unquote shininess of the material, right? So we'll put the roughness there, and I'm just going to put it to like a nice mid gray. Okay. Metallic is, I usually like to show it in spec gloss, because honestly, spec gloss is more closer to the scientific model. It's closer to the scientific model, so it makes a lot more sense in defining it when you're relating it to physics. But this is, metallic seems to be the kind of preferred method now for its simplicity. So metallic is basically, what happens is the light reacts to a surface differently if it's a metal. Basically, the reflected color actually has a color, as opposed to when it's a non-metal, it's just this shade of gray, right? It's this dark shade of gray.
Right.
So instead of defining it in a whole map, we basically just say, hey, is it a metal or is it not a metal, right? So I'm just going to set this to 0 right now, right? 0 being non-metal, white being fully a metal.
Okay.
And everybody still argues, do you set grays? And we set grays personally, but I know some people that never set grays for metallic.
This is that subdivision that we're talking about, right? Eventually, metallic is either white or black right now.
Yeah.
And that's simply not the case. That's not how materials react in physical nature. So
well, and the whole term metallic or metallicity or whatever, it's quite a broad thing, right? And so obviously they mean something else. It's just, this is the easiest thing since there's so much rendering that deals with metal. It's like this broadly applies mostly to metal, but this property can also probably be in these other elements.
Well, the reality is it's just a tool. I mean, all of these things are just tools, right? And so you can use your metalness to get all kinds of cool effects. And we do it regularly with textures, where you can tweak your metalness and you can get some really interesting effects inside of a material. So
cool. Yeah.
Here I'll define our height and normal map, which depending on your pipeline. So if you're more targeting towards film, you may have a stark difference between your height and your normal. But when you're dealing with game, they're usually fairly close. So with this one, we're just gonna basically make them parallel with each other. So I'm just gonna create B&W spots, right? So just a rough noise, and I'm gonna plug this into a normal map generator. So Substance has this new cool height to normal, which actually allows you to define the surface size, which is this whole other thing regarding textile density.
Okay.
But it's super cool. It's super useful. It makes sure that everything is accurate depending on what your sample surface size is. We'll just we'll go ahead and tone down the depth. We'll say that this is, maybe 1.5 centimeters, so it's not quite so rough. And then we'll plug this into normal, and let's plug this into height. And then I'm gonna just give it and then I'll start defining the channels, right? So the first one is the base color, which is simple. It's just the color that we see, right? So, you want it to be green, blue, purple, red, right? Or you can add that, a noise to that. So let's say we take this B&W spots and we plug it through a gradient map, right? And on the gradient map, we define like a couple of different colors, right? And plug that into base color. Well, now that's our color, right? Normal is a normal map. I think most people have come across a normal map, but essentially it's defining RGB a split, right? It's defining the angles going from left to right, top to bottom, and then your fake Z. So if we take like I don't know, like a cube, you'll probably see that a little bit better, right? So let's say we take a I don't know, pyramid. And I'm just going to increase the intensity here, like bake it, right? And now you can see on the, left and right, basically it's kind of defining the angle. So black is like, it's facing that way, white is facing that way. Green means that on the green channel, black is facing up, down, white is facing down, etc. So let's put that back in, right? And let's tone this down because now that's ugly. So then we've got the roughness channel, right? And I'm just gonna plug this back in, the base color, so we can really see what's happening there. Maybe desaturate this a hair. So now on the roughness, right? Essentially, as we bring this down, you'll see that the surface gets more and more reflective, right? Until when we hit 0, right? It's fully reflective as a material, right? As we increase the scale here, let me turn this down again a little bit more so you can really see that reflection, right? As we increase this value, right, the reflection gets more and more diffused. So as we pull this up, what you'll notice is the reflection kind of gets blurred and spread throughout the surface of the material until, you really can't see the reflection anymore. And eventually, right, there's still a highlight. That highlight will dissipate too, right, until it's almost matte. Metallic, like I said, basically with metallic, you have a colored reflection. So metallic materials, they're actually, scientifically, they're black, right? As far as the diffuse color, and you're only getting a color from the specular, from what's actually bouncing back. So, so what you'll see here is as I increase this value, the property of that material kind of changes. Let me decrease our metallic value, or our roughness value here to more, kind of display that a little bit more. And then lastly, we've got our height, which, sometimes for game, having a normal map is enough, right? And it kind of gives us enough shading values for the surface. But occasionally we want a little bit of depth. So let's say this was actually a, and you'll see here, these are some of our sculpted bricks we like to drop in. Sometimes it's nice. We still just sculpt stuff in ZBrush and kind of stamp them in. But let's go ahead and grab just like a brick generator, and let's plug this in, right? And you'll see it's got the, kind of, nice angles there. But if you look from the side, we're really not getting a lot of depth, right? So if we plug this into our height map, right, and I go ahead and turn on, set this to edit, and increase the height scale, it'll give like that fake depth, right? And that's what the height map is primarily used for. So, the collection of these different images is what constitutes as a material. Now, there's a million other channels that you can define. If you take a look at here, right, we've got, let's see, channels, we've got specular level, we could have like a subsurface depending on the shader. We could have translucency, opacity. But for a standard material, these are the kind of 5 textures that we're looking at. Awesome. So that's kind of just a brief overview of, like how a material, what it means when we're saying a material. It's basically these set of textures.
Well, I have to say it's probably one of the best answers I've ever gotten to, a question with 5 words in it. What is a material? So that was great. And,
Sorry,
don't apologize, because it's so necessary, and it's easy for people to to just assume that, the tools they are given are the tools that, exist, and that's the end of the equation. But like, we've been through the conversation of, okay, so you paint your specular. This is shiny. Oh, it's too shiny. Now I got to dial down shiny, right? Now we're in the PBR conversation. And I think it's relevant and important that people understand, that, there's a building block to the mathematical concepts here, and the mathematical concepts aren't reality. And so that's the part that's changing. And one of the things, and you guys can tell me what you think here, but one of the things that I like to tell people is that, we as artists, like, we're in this in-between space where we mastering the technical side of it and all the math, like, that tends to take the artist out of you to some extent. If you go far off to the side, because I've coded before, and coding is so addictive. It's so beautiful.
It is.
And there's always an answer if you can just stay up late enough to find it, right? It's crazy. But then the artist is over here, and the artist is like, I was just telling somebody, is Alina in here? Because I think this conversation was with Alina. No, she's not in today. So basically, a 3D artist has to be Spock and Captain Kirk at the same time.
It's true. Yeah. No, it totally. That's a great analogy.
It really is. Yeah, it really is.
That's a great analogy, and I can absolutely, because I've switched from doing primarily art to doing primarily code now, and there's a beauty in both.
Yeah.
And there's just kind of a leaning one way or the other in both aspects of it.
Yeah.
Well, I think what comes is this perspective of this realization that everything is just a tool, right? And I've noticed as my career went on and on that I feel so comfortable with most technology. Like, if you were to give me Modo or Blender or whatever, I could hop into it knowing only Maya right now, and I'm pretty confident that I could be making pretty nice renders within just a day or two of messing around with it. But it's all about learning tools and getting that perspective and that confidence with what you're doing.
That's great.
And just this understanding of the technical parts of it.
Right, and the core kind of concepts, because now you've been doing this so long, you probably have just vast understanding of what's going on in terms of ray casting and, what roughness is. Something comes down and then it breaks out into so many rays. So, you
Sure, yeah.
So tell me now, at gametextures.com, what's the product that's being sold now? Substance files, textures? What's the product that's there?
Right now, it's so on Game Textures 2. This is our second iteration of Game Textures. It's kind of a mess. It represents, I'll say, 3 distinct eras of texturing technology, which is everything from pre-PBR to PBR to procedural. And man, we even have photogrammetry stuff in there. So we'll say there's 4 different distinct texturing technologies happening right now.
Yeah, and then even in the PBR, we've split from, there's some that are just PBR spec gloss, and then there's some that are PBR metallic roughness and spec gloss. So
it's kind of a mess. And that's to be expected, right? We were kind of building all of these products before all of these technologies came along, and then we were always quick to adapt to new technologies. So what Arvin's working on right now and what we're working on right now is this total overhaul of every single product in our library to convert each and every single one of them to a physically based substance, which uses that materializer program that he just had up, which is our pipeline tool. Materializer is what it's called.
Right.
Not to mention to ship to. Go ahead, Tanner. Sorry.
Yeah, and the shift to.
Basically, we're shipping multiple material types now, so for different engines.
Okay.
So we use Substance to generate, I don't know, you can tell, Arvin, 16 or 17 different texture types at this point.
Right. So now instead of, before we just ship PBR metallic, PBR spec, and Substance, that's currently what, I'd say 90% of the materials on the site have. In this new iteration, we're shipping specific types for specific render engines. So when the new site launches, which hopefully will be sooner than later, we'll have substances and we'll have textures, but we'll also have something that say, hey, this is a redshift material, or hey, this is an octane material. This is a cycles material, right. And it would be an instant import to pull in and apply that texture.
Okay. And that's why you had to kind of build your own side of it, so that somebody could come to the site. So basically, tell me if I'm correct. Somebody comes to the site, gametextures.com, and let's say they're V-Ray, and they see that texture. So if they were to export if you pull something like that right now, there might be differences because the map's not.
They would essentially have to hack it together to make it work inside of V-Ray. All of our stuff works really well inside of Unreal Engine or whatever, UDK or Unity.
Yeah.
But if you wanted V-Ray, you would have to hack it together. So what we did was we built a system which spits out those exact texture maps that V-Ray requires, so that a user can just come and be like, oh, cool, I want the V-Ray version of this, and plug in whatever, diffuse to diffuse, reflection to reflection, F0 to F0, whatever. The specific maps, and then just eliminate that whole part of the process for them.
Yeah, and the hope is eventually, we're starting off with a few supported engines, but eventually the idea is you wouldn't even have to put it together yourself. There's a file that you just download, and you say import, and when you import that file, it assembles the material for you.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It's kind of this methodology we're looking at right now, is the game industry specifically is transitioning away from the actual creation of materials in a lot of ways. There's a lot of people that are doing it, but with the implementation of new technology like Substance Painter, the real push is to eliminate the whole technical part of material creation. And that's not to say you shouldn't learn it, because you absolutely should learn what this is. So our goal is to, help those people that don't want to or are not interested in creating their own materials, and make those who are work a little bit faster, right? Because you don't need to make you don't need to make 1,000 different bricks for yourself. You don't need to make 1,000 different concretes for yourself. It's just not necessary as an artist at this day and age. So.
Right, or even say, a concept artist in ZBrush. I know I have a couple of concept artist friends that recently they're working in full 3D now. They'll go into ZBrush, then they'll hit export to Keyshot, right? They don't really want to have to sit there and construct the metal. They just want to hey, here's the metal that I want. It's, it looks like, old rusted steel, and they just drag and drop it to that section. And so people can kind of focus on what they're good at and what they want to do.
Yeah.
Right. Like a character artist, you don't really want to, because, obviously I did ZBrush workshop. So I actually started off, I wanted to be a character artist. That was my thing. That was my jam.
Yeah.
Right. But eventually, you're if you're working on a character, you're like, man, I don't want to stop working on my character so I can build 12 materials so I can slap them on this character and then, figure out something is wrong or something doesn't look right and have to go back and remake it, right? Let me just slap some stuff on there, see if it looks right. And then if I need to, I can tweak it.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So it's kind of interesting. Mostly what we're concerned about is making sure that we understand where the industry is going. Yeah, as far as production, right? And I'm guessing all of these people in this chat will be involved in production at some point in the near future.
And you're seeing Substance Painter as kind of the big play, or something. I see
it as a massive play. Absolutely, absolutely. The amount of products that studios are making now, materials that studios are making now for themselves is just at the absolute bottom of the well. Like you don't need to use things. They use services like us. They use services like Substance Source, right? Like they don't need to be spending time on all of these products. And what matters to a studio is production speed. So if you can say, hey, this let's just, I saw people talking about it earlier, AK-47 material. This AK-47 model is going to take 5 materials. We need a plastic, we need a wood, we need a metal, we need a rusty metal. Those are 6 different assets or 5 different assets you need to build in order just to build a single prop.
Right.
And you don't have to be a mathematician to take away what kind of production value that looks like. Like it's a lot of work, and extrapolate that to an entire game itself, or an entire scene or entire movie. All of a sudden you're spending, I don't know, tens of thousands of man hours building materials and building these things that aren't necessarily the best use of your time. If you could tell me, hey, you could build 30 props, or you could build one prop and 6 materials in the same amount of time, what would you pick? Right. From a production standpoint. So I think that it's important to understand what materials look like and what all of this looks like. And if your heart is really into creating materials, get into it, because it's awesome. I mean, it's really one of the funnest things you could do. As far as production though, I think that Painter is where it's at moving forward.
Yeah, one of the great things about Painter is now you're stacking materials, right, as opposed to beforehand, where you're literally painting in every single channel to make sure every channel is correct, right? I remember before, I was working in this was even in Dido, right? I was working in Dido, and I'd pull in the channels, and you could kind of somewhat layer materials like in Dido 1, right? You could somewhat layer materials and do some procedural techniques on them. But at the end of the day, I'd still come in and I'd still do some manual painting on stuff, right? Yeah. With Painter, the idea is you're like, hey, this is metal, this is steel, this is plastic, and you just literally, one of our coworkers, he's like, it's literally like paint by number, just like metal, rust, whatever, and then just mask everything out. You're solid.
Yeah. What do you think are some of the key things people need to master inside a Substance Painter? Because what I'm seeing Jan's note down here, he's saying that if you can master designer, Painter is really not that big of a deal. But then there are things inside of Painter that you have to know, like using generators or using masks, or putting a paint layer on to paint things out. What are the things that you think are really important inside of Painter that just are core?
I can handle it from an existential standpoint, and Arv can probably get into the technical part of it. But a texture, our job as a texture artist in building texture is only to give context to a world and give context to an environment. So, from a very top-down perspective, you should be looking at being able to tell a story with your tools and the tools that you have, and using Substance Painter to broadcast a story. Nobody wants just a metal, a stop sign, right? That's not interesting. People do want to see like a stop sign with bullet holes, right? Like if you're using Substance Painter, your focus can't all just be on generators and can't be on using the procedural elements of it. You still have to be very focused on building a story around everything that you texture and making it give context to a world or a scene. And yeah, and then I'm sure Arvin could get into the technical stuff there.
Sorry, I realized I was like, nobody's talking anymore, and I realized I just didn't, I stopped scrolling for some reason.
Yeah, so no, they're going hard. We have a lot of questions to catch up on.
I didn't know if there was anything there I was missing, but anyway, so if you were asking something while I was doing stuff, I apologize. I completely missed it.
No, the question's real. Just what's the couple of things that people really need to know in Substance?
I would say in Painter, right, the main thing is, and I actually I see this in student work, is the thing people need to start doing is when they start, what I initially see is they heavy hand a lot of detail, right? As Sanders saying, you're trying to tell a story, right? And when you heavy hand a detail, it's kind of like, if you're telling a story, it's like, if I was telling Jack and the Beanstalk, I'd be like, once upon a time, there's a boy named Jack, and then the giant fell down the beanstalk, and because he chopped it down, and he got the golden goose, the end, right? And that's kind of what happens when you heavy hand a texture, right? When you heavy hand a texture, it's like you put like, hey, here's the steel, right? And then the thing that everybody always does is they're just like slap a rust on there, right? And the rust is thick, and it's just like at random places, and you're like, well, it's cool that you put, rust on top of the steel, but I mean, you really kind of made that kind of a little too heavy-handed, right? It kind of hurts. So the idea is subtle layers, right? That's kind of what I tend to say is, hey, a lot of subtle layers goes a long way. The kind of balance that I try to explain is if you're putting it in a lot of places, just as a general rule, right? If you're spreading it over a lot of places, then thin out your opacity. Don't make it so thick. Mm-hmm. If you're making it thick, then make it gather to specific places and don't make it go everywhere, right? I think the thing that people really need to master, if you're just talking painter, is that sense of balance, right? If you can get that balance of, adding subtle layers of detail without just wanting to be very harsh with it, I think you get a nice, even, good-looking piece.
I'm surprised we both took the artistic route there, because I totally agree with you. Subtlety is the artist's best friend, and I had a great teacher in school in 2009 who explained to me one way to think about what you're creating with the texture is essentially you have this opportunity to reward your viewers with what you're building, with art in general, right? It's this opportunity to reward somebody for stopping and taking a look, a more detailed look, a second look, a third look, and saying like, hey, wow, that's really nice that somebody put in that extra little detail. It's subtle, and I never would have saw it if I didn't stop and take a look at it. And that's really one of the key principles to video game art in general. Is it's really easy to make a generic world, but it's not easy to make a world that's going to make people stop and say, hey, these people really put that extra thought in there. And sometimes that's just a single detail, right? Sometimes it's just a little thing, little broken nail or a chipped brick or something like that. It's just a little thing that can make all the difference in the world.
I love that. So there's two concepts there, guys, that I think are really important for us to get. And one of them is the idea of being heavy-handed, which is like the Cliff Note version of the story, which, doesn't have all the details. And then the other one that Tanner was talking about was this idea of rewarding people for spending time on your work, right? And that's the devil in the details. But I think that's a fantastic way for us to look at that. Because, everybody here is grinding on their models. And, we as artists, we might be thinking, all right, shit, I'm not fast enough. It doesn't look good enough. I should be, we have all these expectations, all this crap and baggage. But really, this is a great way of looking at it, which is if you're going to tell a story, tell a story. Do it right. Tell the whole story. And reward people for listening, for taking the time. That's a great way to phrase all that.
It's a nice thank you to the viewer, and that's what we're doing, right? Is we're building art for viewers, and whether it's just a video game, whatever AK-47, or you're building like a crazy orc model or something like that, spending that extra time to put in that extra detail is, and it doesn't even have to be a big detail, right? That's what makes art so interesting, is that you can really make it rewarding to look at and make it really inspiring to others with just very simple touches.
You'll notice, to add to that, you'll notice a lot of experienced texture artists, if you post your work, their comments will be regarding really small details. They'll be like, hey, I really love the way you added a small little chip in that corner, or I love the way that in this particular spot the moss gathers, And when you don't know what to look for, you initially look at like, what in the world are they talking about? Why are they paying attention to that? But that's kind of where it leads, I feel like.
Yeah.
Oh, it's easy to make a brick wall. I mean, that's the thing, right? All of this technology makes it really easy to build a brick wall, and this is what we've always said, right? Is that you can build a brick wall, it'll look like a brick wall. Well, how are you going to make it look like art, right? At what point does building something procedurally still maintain its artistry? And how do we do that as a texture artist? And I reference this a lot, is the guys who work on Uncharted. I'm sure everybody here has played Uncharted, right? They got very famous for their style, this like, what do you call it, Arvin? The like
hyper-real?
Hyper-real, yes. The hyper-realistic 3D style where they're building these realistic textures, but they're employing artistic principles of composition and color theory and balance and, rewarding the viewer and using layers to build these very rewarding pieces of art that are still realistic and still procedurally based, but they're using their past experience in art and understanding of art concepts in general to make them that much better.
To kind of go relate to other people who aren't texture artists necessarily. I actually remembered watching some of your tutorials, Ryan, and you'd be like, man, I just love the way that the bicep kind of curves right there, just that little hint, or the little divot right there in his, whatever. It's like, it's just perfect the way it just kind of slopes. Nice. I'm like, okay, I don't know what you're talking about, man, but eventually I did, right, as far as the anatomy goes.
Yeah.
Eventually, you're like, talking about
we had a teacher at Full Sail in 2008, Ryan, that would just put on your videos during class. That was like
good, man.
We would sit there and we'd be like, what are we paying for?
Where's my royalty check?
Yeah, it eventually stopped doing that, but it was like, wow, okay, this is the guy. Cool.
Yeah. Nice, that's funny.
Yeah, nobody knows.
All right, well, why don't we open this up to a couple of questions, and I think we got a few. Samantha's got one, so some of these questions relate, some don't. So let's see. So Samantha's asking, so do you go out and take pictures for textures, or scan, or spend time with real textures? Do you make notes about how they feel? If you do make notes, what kind of things would you list about a texture? It's a cool question.
That is a cool question.
Yeah.
Samantha, I covered this earlier in chat while Arvin was giving his demonstration a little bit. I said that there's no wrong way to make a texture, and there's no, I'm paraphrasing myself because I don't remember exactly what I said, but I don't think there's an incorrect way to build a material. Every tool you have should be used as a tool to your advantage. So yeah, we scan stuff. We have people scanning whatever rocks and bricks and dirt, and we have people building leaves and all of these different things, and then we put them together in a texture. Let me see. Do you make notes on how it feels and so on? I don't know. I mostly take pictures with my iPhone.
Yeah.
And just try to be conscientious of what's around me and try to remember these little stories.
What are one thing? Sorry, go for it. Arvin.
Go ahead, Ryan.
No.
I was just gonna say one thing I noticed. We got to go out of town one weekend.
He only lets you out one weekend?
Yeah, that's really all I get. The rest of the time I'm building this stuff. No, my family recently we went out of town, and we got this little lake house. And the thing I can say to that is that there is a stark difference between looking at a picture, right, no matter what resolution it is, to actually looking at the thing in real life, right? I saw this tree, and it was an older tree, a wider tree, and there was like layers of moss on it, and I really looked at the moss, and I was like, oh, okay, that's what moss looks like, as opposed to getting a picture, no matter how close or far it is, it just doesn't really do it justice. Now, I don't mean don't take a picture, definitely take a picture, but there is an incredible value to actually seeing it in real life and making some at least mental notes, right, about what it looks like. I mean, I don't know if I've ever really looked at it and thought about how it made me feel. Although I was conscious of it.
Moss always makes me feel very emotional.
it was. I mean, there's this moment of awe when you first look at it, right? Because you're really looking at it, or you're really looking at it. You're like, wow, that's what I've been kind of trying to recreate, or that's what that picture was trying to describe, and it doesn't quite do it justice to actually when you actually look at it. So it's kind of cool in that sense.
I think so. Yeah. So I think that's a great question, Samantha, and I think there's value in being outside and value in finding those materials by yourself and seeing them with your own eyes and just thinking about them. I don't know that I've ever taken notes with a notebook or something like that. But yeah, smelling them, all of the.
All right, Jan's got a couple questions. Okay, so he's asking, would you use procedurals and would you use? I'm a little confused by your question, Jan. But basically, if you're using procedurals, do you use Photoshop to give it some oomph? And we were talking about this earlier. Like, what role does Photoshop even have in this equation now?
I actually have some demonstrations, but Tanner, why don't you go first, and then I'll show the actual physical stuff.
I think that Photoshop is extremely important. It depends on what you're going into and what kind of field you're going into and what you're looking at. But if you don't know how to use Photoshop, you're going to stumble in some cases. It can't be overstated that procedural is a technology of the future, but you can't do everything with it. You can't. I mean, this is a great example. One of our artists was making like a WD-40 or a can of spray paint rather, right? And he modeled it all out and did all this stuff with procedural stuff, but he still needed to build a label, right? he still needed to understand how to use Photoshop and still needed to understand all of these things. So I think that, again, it goes back to remembering that all of these things are just tools and that you should use the right tool for the right job. And there's no sense in spending 16 years in Substance Designer building a procedural label maker when you can do it in 10 minutes in Photoshop. And again, there's no sense in spending 16 years building the perfect brick in Substance Designer when you can sculpt it in 7 seconds in ZBrush. It's just there's no sense. So it all comes down to understanding the technology and understanding how best to employ it in a certain situation, which is going to both speed you up and give you the quality that you're looking for. And there's some answers there, there's some ways that are right and some ways that are wrong, and that's all part of just gaining experience and using this technology to move forward, challenging yourself.
Cool.
I'll say this, first of all, we still are very dependent. Let me pull your basis real quick here, because I have it on the same area I have Designer, right? But there's still some very high value. I'll speak to Photoshop in a second, but there's still some really high value in sculpting, right? Like actually going in and sculpting. Like I said, like for our stuff, and so we did these, I don't even remember who did these brick sets. I think this was Matt, right? But basically we did a brick set where we just, laid them out and we just kind of swapped bricks. I mean, you could just as easily, I think we did ours in Designer, but honestly, you could go to Photoshop, get some great snapping, right? And pull these things in and kind of just lay them out brick by brick, right?
He used Mudbox for those. Mudbox.
Oh, okay, he used Mudbox to sculpt them. Yeah, but you could go to Photoshop, create a 2048 by 2048, and just slap these bricks in a row, right? And use a height blend between each layer and generate a great texture out of them. I'll show you guys this. This was one material I built, right? And somebody was asking for this like ruin rubble type surface, and it's actually what's in this scene, right? This wall right here. But this
always freaks me out when I see this many nodes. I'm just like, God.
You see that one that Mustafa just posted in there?
So beautiful. No, I didn't see that link yet.
Oh my God.
Let me see here. I think something is a little wrong with the way this is getting defined right now. But I'm just gonna use
Whoa! I see it. Okay.
I'm gonna plug something else here to the roughness, and I'm just gonna adjust it, right? And let me bump this up to about 2K.
Okay.
Right. And I think my normal map here is flipped.
Story of our lives.
So it's an interesting thing. The things we have to do to get the normal maps all facing the right way. But essentially, this is a sculpt. This is this normal map, which isn't generating, right? You see,
it's an old one. Who knows?
Here we go.
Oh, okay.
This normal map is a sculpt. This was a ZBrush sculpt. I took it in. I sculpted each rock, right? I kind of plugged it into where it needed to go. I used ZBrush for it, right? And then I just brought it into Designer. So here are the sculpts, right? So there's a toggle to switch between the two. You can switch between, clean and, damaged, right? But the idea is we use ZBrush to do the layout, right? There was actually one artist on Horizon Zero Dawn that did a couple of textures for game textures, Stefan.
Stefan Grom, yes.
And his stuff is all sculpted in ZBrush, and they look great, right? They look, incredible. I was like, man, I wish I could stop doing some tech work for a little bit to do some of these sculpts because I was very inspired by them.
It's just some things that look too procedural, right?
Yeah, so there's that. There's still a lot of value in handcrafting some things. as far as Photoshop goes, here's one that's very interesting. We did this as kind of a we built essentially a new type of pipeline, so we could create a bunch of materials in a set, right? And so what we did was we built these patterns in Photoshop. We built a bunch of patterns in Photoshop, and then basically you could switch out the patterns, and the tiling pattern here would change in the material, right? So we had this where it was like frame squares. We had one that was like a Cumberland square or whatever else. But you can't build this pattern in Designer, at least not easily. So we had to go into Photoshop or Illustrator or whatever else to build out these series of patterns. So I would say Substance Designer is a great hub, but we try as a philosophy to not depend on it solely, right? We want to be able to pull from other sources as needed.
Got it. That's a great example, because in fact, actually one of the students and I were just actually going through and creating tileable floors like this, and it's a process.
Yeah,
in design.
I mean, it really is. Yeah, it really is. And
this
is
when
pointed out. Yeah, man, the amount of we do a ton of pre-production just to make this easy for ourselves, so we can sit here and figure out exactly how we want to build it. And our goal is volume and quality at a lot of levels, right? So, so a lot of pre-production goes into these processes, and just drawing it out. I used to do this with my UV maps when I was hand painting things in Photoshop. I would sit there with a sketchbook and literally sketch out what my UV would look like and my texture map would look like, so that I could make sure that I was using everything that I knew properly, right? I don't know.
Yeah, awesome. All right, Gregory's asking, the game industry makes an effort to make textures and objects aesthetically pleasing, but do you see in horror games, for example, a market for aesthetically unnerving materials? Imagery that causes discomfort, like how much is it aesthetic? What's the example there?
I follow a couple of artists on ArtStation specifically because they have creepy looking, not materials, but creepy sculpts. They're not blatant. You look at them and you're like Ron Muick, not that he's on ArtStation, but Ron Muick. I mean, you look at the stuff, and I love his art. But you look at it and you're like, this is just weird. It makes me feel like uncomfortable inside.
What are those disgusting eyeball things that Matt made for Halloween that one time?
Oh, that's right. He did some creepy eyeballs.
Those things are fun. I don't even know where those are.
Yeah, I think there's space for that. There's space for things that make people feel uncomfortable. I think that's good, right? In some ways, it's more artistic that way.
I think you should challenge yourself. Yeah, I think it speaks for what you're trying to do, and it really depends on what you're trying to build. But challenge yourself. I think that those things are extremely challenging to do procedurally. To build a material that creeps people out, that's a challenge. It's a challenge for sure, and you really have to get into like the psychology of what makes people scared. Like, what is it, pareidolia or whatever, where you're afraid of like repeating patterns, things like that. There's like some very specific fears that you can there's some very specific fears that you can have and you can exploit, and we've messed with that a few times. It's actually kind of funny.
Daniel Theiger has recently done these too. These are pretty cool.
Tryptophobia, Tryptophobia, that's what it is. Tryptophobia.
Yeah.
You can really take advantage of those like very primal fears and really have a lot of fun with it.
Gross. And there's definitely like a whole genre for this. So guys like Chet Zar, who's a painter, and then there's that guy who used to live with Leonardo DiCaprio. I forget what the painter's name is. I don't think he's with us anymore. Polish guy, I think. And so there's definitely a whole genre, to all of that. So that's pretty cool. All right, let's check out.
I love seeing what people can do with texture, right? It goes back to what I was saying, where you tell a story, give context to a scene.
Yeah.
I also am super inspired by people who can just build a texture and make me feel freaked out by it. That's impressive.
Sweet. All right, Josh is asking about photogrammetry in material creation. You mentioned that you do some of that. And do you think smartphones can be used for it, or what do you see as a direction for that in the future?
Again, another tool. We tend to find photogrammetry to be very cumbersome in our production pipeline. It's slow and error prone, meaning you can spend 2 or 3 hours building a photogrammetry material and have it not turn out.
Yeah.
And that's a high cost of error. So what we tend to use photogrammetry for at this point is for building specific pieces of a material. Somebody posted it in chat above, that leaf material. Mustafa posted it above, showing how we use hybrid scans to build procedural materials. So I can post it again real quick in the chat for people looking.
I can search for it, Tanner.
You can open it up, Arvin.
Yeah, let me post it.
So essentially what we started doing is, instead of trying to build entire materials out of photogrammetry, there it is. Yeah, it's the one on the far left. Yeah. Instead of building entire materials out of photogrammetry, we decided that it was much more cost effective for us to build individual pieces of a material out of photogrammetry. So in this one, you can scroll down, and we have these extremely high resolution scans of each leaf and stick, and even going down to the mud, right? And we use those in Substance Designer to build a procedural material and layer them properly and tell a story with those assets. So I think there's value in it. For us, the cost is, or not even the cost. It's like the risk of it isn't worth it. You don't get this, right? You can hit randomize on this material and get an entirely different thing. You can change the color of it. You can change how much mud there is. You can make it covered in water. You can do all kinds of cool stuff with it. And if you're just doing photogrammetry, you get one version and that's it. Maybe you might not even get that. So
got it.
Yeah, the other thing about it is it's scalable, right? So right now we're at 4K, but eventually, we're gonna hit 8K, we're gonna hit 12K, and a 16K or whatever else, right? And that's a nice thing, is when you're just sampling portions, then all you do is you just expand your sample, right? As opposed to if you captured the whole material, right? Like each of these leaves are probably coming in at maybe at least 2K, right? So that means, hey, we could essentially scale up the sampling size of the texture procedurally to 16K and not lose resolution. So it makes it scalable.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So every tool has its position again, and that's kind of how we look at our pipeline, is by making sure that we're building these things once really well, instead of having to rebuild them over and over and hope that we land on the correct version of itself. And you can see, look at that graph. That's some craziness right there. But
Edison's asking about adding some stylizing to Substance Designer, making it look more like a traditional painting, or adding some element of that to it.
Go nuts, Arv.
That's actually, when I first started Substance Designer, that was all I did. All I did was, I was trying to push it to see how much stylized looks I could get out of it. So, we're talking about this internally for a lot of stuff. So this is my stuff. It's so old, right? But this is the original stuff I was doing procedurally in Designer. I just wanted to get that. This is procedural, yeah.
Okay.
For those of you that are curious, you're like, I want to see it. I don't know where this file is anymore. I have no clue. And then we did also. I did grass, so I was doing hand painted grass in Designer, right? So the short answer is yes, it's possible. The long answer is I don't know how useful it is to build it that way. There's definitely some use to it, meaning you could possibly take layers of a material, paint it in Photoshop, right? Sculpt stuff in ZBrush, paint it in Photoshop, and then kind of stack it all together in Designer, or even use some procedural methods for painting on top of your painting, right? Or maybe procedurally add moss, or procedurally add pebbles on certain sections of it. It's not, Designer isn't tailored for that workflow, but it can do it. It can do it. It is possible. I just don't know if I would say it's the most efficient way to do it.
Well, it's kind of where we get back into using the right tool for the right job, right? And in the end, can Substance Designer, I mean, it's great, but can it really compete with doing a real stylized sculpt in ZBrush?
Right, exactly.
At the same speed and get the same quality.
Or a hand-painted texture in 3D coat, for example.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Using the right tool for the right job and making sure that you're thinking about your project before you start it, and you're not trying to, fit a sphere into a square hole, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there's always room for proceduralism in it. Like, for example, you create, let's say, something like this, right? This is one we did on a live stream, right? You build something like this, and let's say the rocks, you want to put that on a procedural layer that kind of add in as you go. Well, that's something that you could do, right? Or you want to, adjust the dirt to where there's more or less dirt, right? But essentially, there's two different layers of material that you kind of blend back and forth, right? You can still add it.
Yeah. So
got it. Great. Okay.
The right tool.
All right, guys. I think that's about all the questions. I don't think I missed anything, but if I did, where I post this, which will be in the guild, we actually might post this in the studio so everybody there has the benefit, and then we'll turn this into a podcast later. But for those of you who are here, I'll make sure that you guys get the link today, if not early tomorrow. And if you got any questions, you can post them in there, and then we can navigate it from there. And thank you
also,
guys. Yeah,
to be fair, you can feel free to email Arvin and myself.
Awesome.
It's part of our entire ethos as a company is to be responsive and respond and help where we can. Yeah. So I'm Tanner at GameTextures.com, Arvin at GameTextures.com. We're happy to respond and help you, give you feedback, critiques, to do what we can. So awesome. If you want to ask questions, specific questions, go nuts. We're happy to help.
All right, Tanner, Arvin, man, thank you guys so much. This is one of my favorite sessions. We got to really dive in, and not just fun. Like talk about somebody's work, but we got to talk about the whole spectrum. I really appreciate that.
It was fun. It was a ton of fun. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah,
it's nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for the great questions, and thanks for your interest.
Thanks for hanging out, guys.
All right, head over to GameTextures.com. That's where you guys can find them. You got the email addresses in chat if you're here watching chat.
Yeah. And we have a free membership too, so it's great for students. Great for students if you don't want to spend money, come on over, do what you need to do.
Sounds good. All right, take care of yourselves. Thank you again, guys. It was absolutely amazing.
All right, thank you. Take care, guys.
All right, take care. Ciao. Bye.